This presentation is going to focus on the Understanding Science chapter for the Physical Geology course. The learning objectives are listed here, and I will say that you should be reading the chapter in its entirety in preparation for the lab and the chapter assignment, as well as the reading quiz. These presentations will serve as an overview of the chapter, and my aim is not to drag these PowerPoint presentations on very long. I want to make them nice and concise and effective for you, so my recommendation is to read the chapter first, read the text first, then come here, watch the video or listen to it, then proceed on to the assignments, the quiz, the lab, and I think that will ensure the best outcome for you. Okay, so this is a high level sort of chapter, and we'll discuss science in general, some foundational things related to geology, and yeah, scientific method is a big one here. So before we dig into that, we'll talk about what is science. And this is a subject that we've all been exposed to since very young, since grade school. We've been taking science. And if you think about it from that point of view, science is basically, learning about cool stuff about the earth, or maybe life as well, like biology or botany. But basically, science explains natural patterns. So science is the study of natural things and natural phenomena. And so many topics, so many different fields of study fall under the umbrella of science. Another way to think of science is as a method, and it is a method for understanding the natural world. The scientific method, for example, which we'll talk about on the next slide, is just that. It's a method, right? It's a systematic approach to understanding the natural world. I think in more modern times, we can find ourselves in a bit of a trouble when we think of science as more of a worldview, as something you believe in, versus something that you use to understand things, right? So, yes, I would say that would probably be the best way to view science, is as a tool set, right? And yeah, one of the ways that you are able to use science as a tool to understand the natural world is by having something that is testable, right? So certain things cannot be tested. There are a lot of religious beliefs that cannot be proven or disproven by science, because many of the things that are proposed by certain religious or spiritual beliefs are just not testable or falsifiable, right? I don't think I have to give specific examples on that, but let's just take dying, for example. What happens after death? Well, as objective observers, we know what happens to the physical body upon and after death. However, we don't know what happens to the mind, right? Does the mind exist beyond the body? That is an area, that is a question that basically can't be tested by science yet, to date, to our knowledge. And so, can science prove that we continue living beyond death? Well, not in a metaphysical sense, but in a physical sense, yes, science does show that cell decay occurs after physical death. So to a degree, yes, science can tell us some of what happens after death, but maybe not everything. But science in general is based on repeated testing. So it's not just the results of one experiment or one result or one observation. It's repeated testing that really gives science its strength and as well as the strength of peer review. So when work is reviewed by peers in the field, that means that it will become more robust over time and more free of errors or bias over time as well. The scientific method is a iterative process, I think is the best way to describe it, because you don't just go through it once. The whole point of science is to keep going through the cycle of formulating a question or observing a problem and then applying objective experimentation. And for example, one scientist might think that, oh, my experiment is completely objective and free of any and all bias. But when an outside peer reviewer looks at that experiment and they might be able to see, oh, wait a minute, there's a whole lot of bias here, a lot of room for subjective data to creep in, or subjective influence to creep into the data, so this needs to be done again or rethought. That would be like one example where peer review is very important for the scientific process. But basically, you have a question, you have a problem, you want to figure it out, right? You come up maybe with a hypothesis, which would basically be an explanation, a possible explanation for what is causing the thing that you're concerned about. Then you would conduct an experiment, right? Develop ways to test your question to either verify, validate, or falsify your hypothesis. And once you do that, you run your experiments as objectively as possible. You analyze your results, and from those results, you come to a conclusion and try to derive a theory. And that a theory is basically something that can be applied to many different situations. So, casually the word theory can imply guesswork or speculation, but in science, it's an explanation or a conclusion that carries a lot more weight, and especially more weight than like just a hypothesis, right? But a theory is supported by experimental verification and is widely accepted by the scientific community. So it's been tested, retested by multiple people, and it is widely accepted. So let's say you start off with a hypothesis. After a hypothesis has been repeatedly tested for falsifiability through documented and independent study, it can eventually become a scientific theory. So, the term hypothesis usually provides kind of a tentative explanation before an experiment, and then a theory is like the best explanation after being confirmed multiple times. Taking a step back and looking at some early scientific thought and thinkers, this part of the chapter looks at essentially the foundation of science and the scientific method and scientific approach. So back during the empire of the ancient Greece, ancient thinkers like Aristotle would use a type of reasoning called deductive reasoning, which basically applies known principles of thought to establish new ideas or predict new outcomes. So basically they would try to deduce or like make connections or inferences to new things based on things that they already knew, which, is not a bad approach if you don't have anything else, right? So an example that the textbook provides is, using deductive reasoning, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? That seems logical. It's logical. In practice, this might look like if all birds have feathers and a sparrow is a bird, then a sparrow must also have feathers, right? But as logical and straightforward as this line of reasoning may be, it is flawed. There can be mistakes made in here that would basically propagate. So for example, if all animals that fly are birds and birds also fly, then bats must also be birds, and that would be using deductive reasoning, which we know is not true. We know that bats are not birds. The other type of reasoning that contrasts to empirical thinking or deductive reasoning is inductive reasoning. And this begins from new observations and attempts to understand the underlying principles that explain it. So a conclusion made through inductive reasoning would come from using measurable evidence rather than a logical connection or a deduction, right? So for example, to determine whether bats are birds or not, a scientist would list the various characteristics of birds, the presence of feathers, a toothless beak, hollow bones, a lack of forelegs, externally laid eggs, and then the science would check whether bats share the same characteristics. If they do, then they're a bird. If they don't, then it's something else, right? Both of these types of reasoning are important for science because they emphasize, important aspects of science, observation, and also inference. So making connections is very important. And especially in geology, there are a lot of principles that are based on making deductions, making inferences. And scientists really have to use these things in order to explain certain hypotheses and to explain certain observations, especially in geology. But let's see what else I wanted to touch on here. So Galileo and Kepler, they're obviously very important for science as we know it today. Before the Renaissance, we humans had an understanding of the Earth and the celestial bodies that basically believed Earth was at the center of the universe, right? There was really no for their time, there was enough reason to believe, right? Based on deductive reasoning, deductive observations, that this model was true. And this model was called the geocentric model, where Earth was at the center of the universe, right? But early Renaissance scholars like Copernicus, basically they started to challenge this, and they use, observations, their newly available telescopes, mathematical proofs, mathematical models that showed a totally different model of the universe, one in which Earth and other planets orbited around a centrally located sun. And this was, a very big deal, a very big upheaval, right? This caused a lot of problem. This sun-centered model is called the heliocentric model. And those two scientists, Galileo and Kepler, They are basically credited with jumpstarting the scientific revolution and really starting what we kind of consider modern scientific methods, because they basically they focus on empirical data, observable data. And not just that, but also they conducted experiments that could prove or disprove falsifiable ideas. And they based conclusions on mathematical analysis of quantifiable evidence. So these were all really important shifts, having ideas that are falsifiable, like only trying to explain ideas that can be proven wrong, right? Um, this was all a very big departure from deductive reasoning, um, and of course caused a lot of stir, but it was based on objective evidence, and it was really the first time that they were doing that. Moving on to the foundations of modern geology, this section of your textbook touches on a lot of things that we will get into in a little more detail. So I do want you to read this section, but I don't want to spend too much time on here for this presentation. Basically, what I want to emphasize here is that the principles of geology, while they will seem very obvious, logical to us studying them now, at the time they were very controversial. They were just, I don't know if revolutionary is the right word, but it was a big deal to draw some of the conclusions that scientists like Steno and Hutton, James Hutton, drew at the time. So for a long time, we had humans had the understanding of, landscapes and such as being explained by catastrophicism. And so that's basically means that the landscapes that we saw had been like that for forever, basically, from like big sudden events that created, the mountains or created the valleys. And so that's just how the geomorphology and landscapes, landforms were understood. But here in the 17th, 19th centuries come around, and there are these scientists that are saying, wait a minute, especially Nicholas Steno, are saying, wait a minute, actually, it looks like, Earth's surface has changed over time. Like, it's actually a much slower process. And that was a really big deal. And that is also a very important underpin or foundation of geology. But I'll leave it here for now because a lot of the things, uniformitarianism, geologic time, evolutionary thoughts, things like that, we're going to get into them in more detail in other chapters. So for now, you can read a few paragraphs in the book about that, just to get you familiar with it, but we'll dig into it more later. Okay, so what is the study of geology? Finally, we get to some geology, right? Well, geology is one of those sciences, one of those studies that fall under the umbrella of science, right? That's why we're talking about it. And it uses a scientific method to study Earth's materials, processes, and history. Geologic knowledge, of course, isn't the most important thing. It's the most important science. Because it is essential for resource management, hazard migration, and environmental impact analysis and understanding, right? There's a lot to unpack there. Resource management, what does that mean? If you think about the life you're living today in the modern world, it would be impossible to live this life to live as long as we do, to have the health spans that we do without natural resources, without hydrocarbons that are extracted, without rare earth minerals or common minerals that are extracted from the earth, from the earth's crust. We really do need geology, for our lifestyles, right? And not just lifestyles, for our lives, like power. I mean, just power alone. I feel like I don't have to explain that much further, but imagine what your life would be like if there wasn't, electricity to power a hospital, right? Let alone thinking about not having a car. Think about, how we use power, right? And energy. All those forms of energy. Of course, with the exception of, wind and solar, by and large, the energy that we as Americans rely on is based on hydrocarbons. And those hydrocarbons would not be accessible to us if we did not have an understanding of geology. Now, geology as a study, I think is wonderful, but I am a bit biased there. It's a very interdisciplinary study. It combines physics, chemistry, biology. In my undergraduate work, I studied environmental impacts as well, environmental sciences, biology, botany. So it's a lot. It's a very fun, I think, course of study. I mentioned some reasons why studying geology is important in the last slide, but basically, natural resources, very important to, essential to society, but also geologists have an understanding, helps us as societies, as cities, as a civilization, understand and prepare for natural hazards. So, the building codes in California are very much impacted by the prevalence of earthquakes across the state. So having an understanding of natural hazards, geologic hazards, has a real life and direct impact on the decisions we make as communities and as a society. The rock cycle explains how Earth materials form, change, and relate to one another. So if we start off, well, I should first start by saying that there are three types of rocks. You have metamorphic rocks, igneous, and sedimentary rocks, right? So let's just say we start with sediment here. We have sediment, think of sand or, clay at the bottom of a lake. It gets transported through rivers, streams, what have you, transported, right, deposited. And then it gets buried. And when it gets buried deep enough, it becomes lithified, meaning that the grains become fused, and you go from having individual grains to having a rock, right? So you go from sediment to a rock, and that type of rock is called a sedimentary rock. Now that sedimentary rock can continue to be buried, and as it is buried deeper and deeper into the crust, it experiences higher heat, higher temperature, and higher pressure. That pressure will change the rock, hence metamorphic, changing, right? You change that rock, the minerals within that rock are, rearranged, and it becomes a metamorphic rock. That metamorphic rock can continue to get buried, and at some point, with enough temperature and enough pressure, it will melt, and you will create a magma. Now that magma will, at some point, cool. It might move to a shallower part of the crust, and it will begin to cool. As it cools, it solidifies. It's no longer molten, and that solidified magma becomes an igneous rock. Now that igneous rock, let's say it gets exhumed at the surface, either that magma rises to the surface through a volcano, or there's, a mountain building event, if you will. That igneous rock is exposed to the surface, water's hitting it, glaciers are hitting it, rubbing against it, eroding it, right, weathering it, and that's how you create sediment, right, through chemical and physical processes, weathering processes rather, and you get back to sediment. So that's just like a basic example of how you would go through the rock cycle. Yeah. Plate tectonics is a very important theory. It is a very recent, but pretty recently accepted theory, widely accepted theory, and it is a really big deal in geology. It's foundational. It helps explain a lot of the different phenomena that we see: volcanoes, earthquakes, trenches, just so many different phenomena that we see is explained by plate tectonics. So it is a widely accepted theory. And you basically, plate tectonics theory, the idea is that you have these tectonic plates that float on top of the mantle. So the Earth, you've probably heard of the 3 layers of the Earth: crust, mantle, core, right? Those are the chemical layers. But here in this course, you'll learn about physical layers of the Earth, which are similar to the chemical layers, but there are a few more. So basically you have the crust, which you know is very solid, cooler, relatively speaking, but the uppermost part of the mantle is also still very solid. It behaves like a solid rather than a fluid. And that's not to say that the mantle is molten, it's just ductile, like it can flow and move, but that's not to say that it's liquid. So thinking of the mantle as liquid is not really accurate, but the uppermost part of the crust and the uppermost part of the mantle, that makes the lithosphere. And so the plate tectonic theory basically says that the lithosphere is broken up into plates, and the plates are basically just very large sections of the lithosphere, broken up sections, and those plates interact with each other. Like they might move toward each other, away from each other, or slide past each other, and that movement helps explain a lot of different phenomena we see, like earthquakes and volcanoes or mountain building in certain areas. So we will talk more about the plate tectonic theory in terms of how we got to that theory, what came before it, and what it helps explain. Geologic time, if you've never really thought about it, can be overwhelming at first when you really try to put it into perspective. 4.54 billion years is the estimated time, the estimated age of the Earth, which is, pretty significant when you think about how it compares to our very much shorter lifespans. So when you're comparing those two things, the human lifespan versus the geologic time scale, it's much shorter, and it can be a struggle to comprehend the depth of geologic time and really the slowness of geologic processes. And it is quite something when you're out in front of an amazing outcrop or a canyon, and you're looking at these geologic exposures and really looking at them with the understanding of how long it took to build those units, those rocks, those sediments. It's really just amazing. I think is the best way to put it. It's amazing. So the geologic time is massive, and most of the geologic record actually doesn't go as far back as the age of the Earth. So we really focus, so here on this side here, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer. Let's see. Yeah, here, so here you have geologic time scale. Here's the present. here's 4.6 million years ago, so MA would be million years ago. And so much of geologic history, or what's recorded in the geology in the rock, is contained up here within the last 500 million years. Beyond that, we have other, we have other time periods here, the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic. But really, for most of the geology we look at, that I've ever looked at, has been from the Phanerozoic. And so we'll focus more on the last 542 million years here, which is divided into three eras, which would be your Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And each of these are further divided into periods. And I mean, it goes into further detail. So each of these periods are further divided, but for the scale and scope of this course, we won't go beyond the period. But yeah, we will be digging into that as well. Geologists use a wide range of tools, and it really depends on the type of geology you're doing, the focus you have, the question you're trying to answer. But if you're on the field, you're mapping sections, you're going to, of course, have rock hammers, compasses, lenses, etc. Lots of scientists work in labs, using microscopes, spectrometers, different types of radar. But I would say a lot of geologists end up working, in offices behind computers, running models, and really doing a lot of research. Much of the work I did in the oil industry was sitting behind a desk and, compiling a lot of studies, looking at different well logs from various wells, looking at a lot of different data sets, but I was rarely out in the field actually collecting data. Much of the data I used were either lab results or the results of seismic imaging. So depending on what your focus is, what your goals are, geologists have a wide range of tools to choose from. I wouldn't typically address science denial unless it was brought up by a student in the class, but because it is in the textbook, I've made a slide for it. And basically, science denial is it's a real thing. It's people that don't agree with basically scientific theories, that argue that established scientific theories are wrong and that they're not based on scientific merit, but rather on subjective ideology. Science denial generally is held up by three basic arguments. So the first one being that the first argument basically tries to undermine the credibility of the scientific conclusion itself by claiming that the research methods itself, the methods are flawed, or that the theory is actually not universally accepted and the science is unsettled. Another way of denying science is using the argument that claims the researchers are not objective and are motivated by an ideology or an economic agenda. And then a third strategy that is deployed by science deniers is to demand a balanced view or equal time in coverage, our media coverage, and educational curricula to help propagate the illusion that both sides are equally valid arguments, right? And so the textbook gives the example of climate denier, or like people that deny climate change is a real thing despite, the overwhelming amount of scientific evidence, and they'll deploy these kind of tactics to take down or try to attack uh, established and supported science conclusions or scientific theories. Yeah, I think it's an important thing to be aware of, to understand where and how someone that might not have a scientific background, how they might attack a scientific idea. And so, hopefully by the end of this course, you will have a better understanding of course, geology as a whole, but you'll get to see the scientific method in action. As you learn through new things, you'll see how what we know or the theories that we are using are based on observation. And so you'll get a chance to see what those observations are and how those observations led to the theories. One of the most important skills, I think, for everyone nowadays is being able to evaluate sources of information. How do you know what to trust? Especially now with AI, it's really a pretty big problem and kind of a concern. So when you're looking at sources, you want to look at author credibility, look at funding sources, make sure that the journals are, reputable, have a long history of transparent peer review, have a long history of a transparent peer review process. When you're specifically looking at a particular study, look at how clearly the methodology is described and written, and what kind of details are involved. Are the experiments themselves reproducible? These things, when you're analyzing individual studies, are really important to see, to gauge the credibility of a study, is to have an understanding of whether or not it is reproducible. Can someone else do that experiment and potentially come up with the same results? To wrap up, science is an ongoing process with no absolute beginning or end. Conclusions should be based on objective evidence and help form unifying models or theories. And yeah, we talked about some general geologic principles, concepts, things that we will be digging into more detail as we move through the course. And I added here 2 pictures of me doing science in China during my field work, during my graduate work at LSU. So certainly geology has afforded me the opportunity to travel, but once I was actually in the private sector, in the oil industry, I did very little traveling. So most of my traveling was while I was doing research. But yeah, so I hope you all like the course. I hope you're excited to learn about rocks. I don't spend too much time talking about careers and things like that are available to geologists, but of course, if you have questions about that, if you have a more keen interest in geology and would like to know more about it as a potential career, I'm happy to talk one-on-one with any student who would like to have that conversation. And otherwise, any other student that might have questions about anything else can certainly reach out to me as well. All right, y'all. We'll talk soon.